Okay, let's learn. We are on 37b3, Lamed Zayin Mavez, towards the bottom of the page. Amar Ravasi, Isa shel Meiser Sheni. Okay, dough made of Meiser Sheni. Again, what is Meiser Sheni? You have Truma is the first thing you take from your. We're going to be like masters at the Meisters by the time we're done with this. Okay, so basically the first thing you do is you give something to a Kohen. Okay, it's not as defined as an amount. You give Truma to the Kohen. Then you have Meiser Rishon given 10% to the Levi. Then Meiser Sheni is 10% that's taken to Yerushalayim and eaten in Yerushalayim. That is Meiser Sheni, eaten by all of us, by Yisraelim, but it's eaten in Yerushalayim. The question now is, Isa shel Meiser Sheni, dough made from grain of Meiser Sheni, L'divrei Meir Petrum and Achala. Rameir holds that you do not have to give challah from it. Okay, we'll talk about wine. We'll review wine in a moment. L'divrei Chamim chayavis b'challah. According to the Chachamim, you do have to give challah from Meiser Sheni. Again, so it's grain. You're making regular challah, but according to Rameir, he says there's no obligation to remove challah. Right, the separation, giving it to Kohen back in the day, you do not have to do that, or nowadays take it off and burn it. You do not have to do that when it's Meiser Sheni. Okay, now he extrapolates further. We're at Lamed Ches Med Aleph. Matzah shel Meiser Sheni. Let's see a matzah made from Meiser Sheni. The different Meir ein adam yotzei ba yedei chavasam Pesach. Meir says you do not fulfill your obligation if you make matzah on Pesach and Meiser Sheni. You would not fulfill your obligation. L'divrei Chachamim yotzei ba yedei chavasam Pesach. According to the Chachamim, you do fulfill your obligation on Pesach. And now one last example: esrog shel Meiser Sheni. Let's say you have an esrog of Meiser Sheni. L'divrei Meir ein yotzei bo yedei chavasam Yom Tov. According to Meir, a person does not fulfill his obligation on Yom Tov with it. According to the Chamim, you do fulfill your obligation with a Meiser Sheni esrog. Okay, Maskal or Papa. Papa asks a question on Ravasi, who is the one who just said that last long paragraph. Bishlama Isa, I understand challah dough, dichsiv ariso sechem. The pasuk says it should be your dough. Mishalachem, it has to be yours. Okay, and basically the understanding is that Meiser Sheni is something that although you get to eat it, it's not really yours. In other words, if it's yours, I can do whatever I want with it. No, but Meiser Sheni has certain limitations, has certain rules. So Hashem says you have to eat in Yerushalayim, meaning it's quasi yours, it's not fully yours, and therefore we can understand that right. So basically, we can understand that it's not fully yours, and therefore you do not fulfill your obligation. You do not have an obligation of challah because since it is not fully yours. Okay, esrog nami. When it comes to an esrog also, dichsivu lekachtem lachem. You should take for yourselves lachem mishalachem yehei. It has to be yours. Right. This actually is the reason why in the first day of Pesach that many people, theoretically, we could have one esrog and just lend it out to everyone. The reason we don't do that is that the Torah says it should be your esrog, and really you have to own it. That's why on the first day of Sukkot, if you want to, you can't really borrow an esrog. What you have to do is, if you don't have your own esrog, a little of an esrog, what you have to do is someone has to gift it to you. You have to be, here, it's yours, right? You could have it, and therefore it becomes theirs because you can't borrow an esrog. It has to be yours. And this halach l'maisa, this practically speaking, it has to be your esrog. Okay, ela matzah. When it comes to matzah, miksiv matzah schem. It doesn't say your matzah. What's the problem with matzah? In other words, other ones it says it has to be yours, and therefore Meiser Sheni is not really yours. But with matzah, what's the issue? Why can't you have matzah made from Meiser Sheni? So Amar Rava answers, V'tamer of Yemer bar Shlemya, Asya lechem. We have Gzer Shava, it says lechem, it says bread in two places. Ksiv hacha lechem oni. It says regarding the matzah lechem oni. Ksiv hasam v'haya b'acholchem milechem haaretz. And it says regarding challah that you'll eat the bread of the land. Mala halan mishalachem. Just like by challah, we've already established, it says ariso sechem. It has to be your challah, it has to be your dough, and Meiser Sheni is not yours, afkan. So to matzah, where it also says the word lechem, mishalachem, it has to be yours. Okay, so basically, right, so we're learning, you're right, by matzah doesn't say, as opposed to esrog and Meiser Sheni, it doesn't say, and challah, it doesn't say, it does, sorry, by challah and esrog, it doesn't say yours by matzah, but we say lechem, just like it says bread by matzah, we could extrapolate from matzah of challah, by challah has to be yours, so too by matzah has to be fully yours, and Meiser Sheni not. Lema mesayele, let's bring a brayse that supports Ravasi, or maybe, when you say lema means maybe this supports him. Isa shel Meiser Sheni b'tur min challah. Okay, Rameir says that dough Meiser Sheni is exempt from challah. The Chacham omrim chayeves, and the Chacham say it is subject to challah. So Gemara asks, lema mesayeh? What do you mean? Let us say, like meaning lema means like maybe this supports him. Hainu hach. This is exactly what Ravasi said. In other words, it's a great proof. In other words, we introduced the statement by saying maybe this brayse supports him. What do you mean? It says exactly what he says. So no, the Gemara says no. Hachi kamer. This is what we meant to say. Lema midipalig beisa. Let's say just like they argued by challah, b'hanach nami pligi. Maybe they also argue by esrog and matzah, or dilma shamni hasam. Or maybe we'll say that that granted, it's clear from this brisa they say it by chala, but maybe chala is different. Why would chala be different? Because it says your doughs twice. In other words, this brisa is not a full support, because remember, what did Ravasi say? Ravasi said that Meiser Sheni of chala, Meiser Sheni esrog, Meiser Sheni matzah, all those things you have this debate as to whether or not you could be used because it's not fully yours. Then when this brisa seemingly says exactly what he says, but the Gemara is saying, no, the reason it's not a full-fledged support is because you're right, it's clear that they argue about challah, but maybe challah is different because by challah it says your dough twice, and therefore maybe only there do we have an opinion saying that it has to be really fully yours. But by esrog, it doesn't say it twice, it only says once, lachem. And therefore maybe by esrog they don't have this argument, and even by matzah, maybe they don't have this argument. Okay, fine. The Gemara now continues, 38a2. By Rav Shimon ben Lakish. Rav Shimon ben Lakish asks the question, okay, what's the halacha regarding using now it's two things, right? In other words, until now we're saying right? So what's the halacha regarding using challah made from Meiser Sheni in Yerushalayim? So again, what that means is as follows. A person goes to Yerushalayim with their Meiser Sheni produce, okay? So a person harvests their grain. They give their Truma Tzayu. They give their Meiser Rishon to the Levi. And then they take their Meiser Sheni to Yerushalayim, and then they separate challah, okay, because they're making bread. They go ahead, they have grain, right? They're in Yerushalayim with their Meiser Sheni, which is quasi theirs. And then they go ahead and they separate challah, and they give the challah to Jesse, right? So can Jesse go ahead and use that challah to go ahead and fulfill his mitzvah of matzah? That's the question, right? So now it's two things, right? So I have a Meiser Sheni, and I'm separating my challah from it. Can I use it for matzah? So Aliba Rav Yossi Glili Lo Tibailach. According to Rav Yossi Haglili, there's no question. Why? Hashta bechulin lo nafik. Remember, Rav Yossi Glili said you do not fulfill your obligation with Meiser Sheni in general. Why? Anyone remember why? What did Rav Yossi Glili say? One of the Pesukim, Lechem Otni. He says it has to be bread that could be eaten in a sad state, right? He said from the word aninos, and Meiser Sheni cannot be eaten in a sad state, and therefore, according to Rav Yossi Glili, there's no question, because he holds, even if it wasn't challah, even if I didn't give it to Jesse, if it was just Meiser Sheni plain, I wouldn't be able to fulfill my obligation. Would there be any question when it comes to challah? When would the question be? Who is the question according to? Alibid Rabbi Kiva. It's according to Rabbi Kiva, right? Because remember, Rabbi Kiva said lechem oni does not mean it can't be eaten in a state of aninos. He held it has to lechem ani. He held what the word means is that it has to be flour and water, right? But he holds bechulin udenafik. So we know that he holds that if Meiser Sheni is chulin, again, if I take my Meiser Sheni to Yerushalayim and I make matzah out of it, Rabbi Kiva said I do fulfill my obligation. But why? Remember, because the pasuk said it has to be eaten in most that matzah should be eaten anywhere, and yet Meiser Sheni has to be eaten only in Yerushalayim. So why did he say you fulfill your obligation? Dimitamu, because it theoretically, if this Meiser Sheni become tameh, Yeshlan had to b'mal shavos. Then I would be allowed to redeem it and then eat that bread outside of Yerushalayim. Remember, so what's happening over here? So even time Yeshlan, right? So basically, what's happening is that Meiser Sheni, again, I'm only allowed to eat in Yerushalayim, and therefore that should disqualify it from being good matzah. Why? Because matzah has to be eaten everywhere. But Rabbi Kiva explained that no, since if it becomes tameh, if theoretically the Meiser Sheni becomes tameh, what I'm allowed to do is then redeem it. I'm allowed to go ahead and say, oh, it's $10 worth of Meiser Sheni, great. I'm going to put it onto $10 of money, or whatever, $10 plus a fifth of money, and then the grain itself is able to be eaten anywhere. So now the bread could be eaten everywhere, and therefore he says that's the halacha by chulin. However, aval challah, but now that we're talking about something a little more complex. It's Meiser Sheni, and I made it into challah. And what's the halacha of challah? Dimatamya leis batla had to mashavos. If it were to become tameh, it would not be allowed to be eaten in all dwellings. Okay, meaning if challah becomes tameh, what do? L'streifa azla, it gets burnt. Which is, by the way, why we burn the challah nowadays, because we're tameh. So basically, right. So the point is that if challah is tameh, it is not able to be eaten everywhere. Therefore, lo nafik. Therefore, I should not be able to fulfill my obligation. Odilma rinan. Alternatively, we could maybe Rekiva would say it's allowed. Why? Hoel vi lo kar leshem vitame. Since had I not gone ahead and made this into challah, and it would become tameh. Isla heter b'mashavos v'nafik bay. I'd be allowed to eat in all dwellings and fulfill my obligation. Hashdam nafik. I should also be able to fulfill my obligation. In other words, what we're saying over here is that according to Rabbi Kiva, keep in mind, there's like all these, bottom line is we're talking about Meiser Sheni that is also challah. But we're saying at the end of the day, it's Meiser Sheni. It happens to be I also called a challah, and therefore theoretically it became tameh, which is what allows the Meiser Sheni to be eaten everywhere else. But because I also call a challah, it would not be able to be eaten everywhere else. at the end of the day, had I not called it challah, it would be allowed. Had I not defined it as challah, not separated as challah, it would be allowed. Therefore, it should also be allowed over here. In other words, we say since it's only coincidental that I called it challah, that would prevent my heter of Meiser Sheni. So maybe I could ignore that factor and be allowed to eat it, since at the end of the day, it's ultimately Meiser Sheni. Ultimately, what we have over here is Meiser Sheni. It happens to be I called it challah. That shouldn't be a defining factor, and therefore I should be allowed to eat it. I should be able to treat it as regular Meiser Sheni. That's one way of posing the question. Ika da'amri. There's another way of posing the question. Havade lati bailach. That there's certainly nothing to ask about the case of matzah made of Meiser Sheni. That's also challah. Why? Devade amrinan hilhoel. We certainly say that this concept of since. In other words, that had I not pronounced it challah, right, it would have been permitted to be eaten. In other words, going like the second side of that last question we asked, meaning for sure that would be allowed. Kiti bailach, the only time we do have this question is in the following case. Challah halakuach bekesef meiser sheni, okay, so like this. Now we're saying, the first case was a case where a person takes their grain from meiser sheni, brings it to Yerushalayim, okay, and then buys challah with it. Now we're saying, no. What a person did is, while they are still at home, okay, they live in Tiberia. To travel with all the grain, not so simple. So what they do is, we've spoken of this before, is you say, okay, I have $1,000 worth of grain, I'm going to put that onto money, right? I put that onto money, and then I travel into Yerushalayim, and then with that money, I go ahead and I buy bread, okay, or I buy grain, and then when I'm making dough, I go ahead and I separate it as challah. Right? Slight variation. What we'll see is it's going to be a little bit more complicated because of that, okay? Kiti balach. Challah halakuach bekesem meiser sheni. A person is making challah with money that was, with grain that was purchased with meiser sheni money. Valiba d'Rabbanan lo tibailach. There's no question according to the Rabbanan. Kevan da'amri padeh. They hold that such produce can be redeemed even if it becomes tameh. Hainu meiser. It's the same case as meiser sheni. Kiti bailach, who is this question according to? Aliba de Rabbi Yehuda de Amri Kaver. According to Rabbi Yehuda, who says that Meiser Sheni money that became tameh, okay, that food bought with Meiser Sheni money become tameh, has to be buried. Okay, we'll explain why in a second. It's not. Following Mishnah, halakuach bekesa Meiser Sheni shintma. Food purchased with Meiser Sheni money became tameh. Yipada, you're allowed to redeem it. Rabbi Yehuda Amar yikaver. Rabbi Yehuda says has to be buried. So let's just explain this for a second. Everyone agrees if your Meiser Sheni becomes tameh, you could redeem it. Okay, so again, grain that you have in your home, Meiser Sheni grain, I bring it to Yerushalayim, and then when I'm there, it comes into contact with the sheretz, whatever, it becomes tameh, I can redeem it. No questions asked. Okay. Rabbi Yehuda holds, now, if I have money, right, what that means, what does it mean, Meiser Sheni money? Money doesn't grow on trees, as our parents told us, but what does it mean, Meiser Sheni money? What that means, I had grain, I transferred it to money, bring it to Yerushalayim, and now I transfer it back to food when I'm in Yerushalayim, and then it becomes tameh. The Chacham say, okay, so once again, you can redeem it. Rabbi Yehuda says, it's like the power of Meiser Sheni has been too diminished. As they went, from transfer to transfer, there's like a lowering of some level of sanctity, and therefore it's unable to be redeemed at that second stage. If it was your original grain, Meiser Sheni became tameh, okay, I can redeem it. But if it was grain, money, grain, and now it becomes tameh, it's too far. It's too far removed from the original Meiser Sheni. I don't have the ability to transfer it onto money. In other words, the simple way of saying this, the Torah says you can redeem it, is only in its original state. Okay, but the svara, the logic behind it is that it's been too diminished at this point, and I can't redeem it. So Yehuda holds that Meiser Sheni, which was transferred to money, and then bought grain with it, and became tameh, you can't redeem it. And so our question is, according to Rabbi Yehuda, what happens if you have matzah that is purchased with money what if you have matzah that was made out of grain that was purchased with Meiser Sheni money? Since Rabbi Yehuda would hold that that if theoretically, right, the whole allowance of Meiser Sheni in Yerushalayim using matzah made of Meiser Sheni is, since in theory if it became tameh, I'd be able to redeem it, and therefore eat it everywhere, therefore it's allowed. That's the whole basis for it. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, in this case, I wouldn't be able to redeem it. I'd have to bury it. So what Rabbi Yehuda say in this case, it would be allowed. That's the question. Would matzah in this case, now again, we're not talking about the matzah actually being tameh. If the matzah was tameh, you couldn't eat it. Right? We're saying this matzah that was purchased that was made with grain of grain that was purchased with Meiser Sheni money, would you, according to Rabbi Yehuda, would you be allowed to fulfill your obligation with matzah in it? Since if it were to actually become tameh, you would not be allowed to eat it everywhere else. Therefore, maybe it's not allowed. Right? That's the question. Do we say that since had the challah not been purchased Meiser Sheni money. Okay, since the challah, meaning, let's say it was just regular challah, it wouldn't be Meiser Sheni money. Ve'hoel v'lo kara le'shem v'tameh, and since, in theory, had he not called a challah and become tameh, yesh lo hater mashavas nafik bey. Theoretically, had it not had both these things going for it, that it wasn't, that it wasn't purchased with Meiser Sheni money, meaning, let's say it was just regular chulin, and B, since and theoretically, had it not become challah, then yesh lo hater mashavas nafik bey, then you would be allowed to eat, meaning, in theory, since this bread, theoretically, let's say in an alternative reality, you would not have used Meiser Sheni money for it, and theoretically, you would not have called it challah, then this grain would be fine. It would be able to be eaten everywhere. Hashdami nafik bey. Therefore, you could fulfill your obligation with it. Okay. Odilma chad ho'amrinan. Do we say like one since? Trei ho'el lo amrinan, and not two sinces. In other words, again, the whole idea of allowing it to be eaten is we say that, since there's a possibility of something else. Right? So, in other words, the reason Rabbi Kiva, let's go back to Rabbi Kiva a second. The reason Rabbi Kiva said you're allowed to use this Meiser Sheni is because since if it were to become Tameh, you'd be allowed to go ahead and eat it everywhere else. And then you redeem, you're allowed to eat it everywhere else. It's not Tameh right now. We're saying, since if it would, you'd be allowed to eat it everywhere else. So over here, in Rabbi Yehuda, we have to say like two sinces. One, meaning like two theoreticals. Meaning one, since if you theoretically could have not used Meiser Sheni money for this, and B, since if you wouldn't have called a challah, it would also, those would be two reasons, those two factors, had they not been there, would be allowed. Therefore, we say, okay, so let's ignore those two factors, and therefore say it's fine. Or do we say, no, we can only take away one, we can only do one theoretical per minute, and not two theoreticals. Like, again, Rabbi Kiva allows one theoretical, saying, since if it would become tameh, it would be permitted, so therefore it's allowed. Okay, that's one. But over here you have to do two. You have to say, one, since theoretically, if you wouldn't have bought it from Meiser Sheni money, it'd be allowed. And two, since if theoretically you wouldn't have made a challah, it would be allowed, therefore it should be allowed right now. Do we go that far? Because that's two of them. So Amar Rava, Mistaber Shem Meiser Chadhu. Rava wants to say, like almost a simple answer. He says that it's logical to say that Meiser Sheni is Meiser Sheni. We don't start, the fact that it's also challah really doesn't change its reality. At the end of the day, there's a halacha. The halacha is Meiser Sheni allowed to be used for matzah? Yes or no? And if those who say that it's allowed to be used for matzah, like Rabbi Kiva, therefore it's going to be allowed. The fact that it also happens to be challah, at the end of the day, it's called Meiser Sheni, and therefore it should be allowed. And therefore, he wants to argue that even according to Rabbi Yehuda, who would hold that theoretically became tameh, you'd have to bury it, would still say it's going to be allowed in this case, and that is the way that he rules. Okay? Again, tomorrow, 20 minutes before Mincha.